Okay, so we have been practicing tracing the flow of blood places throughout the body. In lab, I think we traced the flow of blood from the heart to the fingers and back. And we can also do that as we trace a drop of blood through the heart. And this, you'll get very good at this. You'll have this memorized. If you can just picture the box-like diagram of the heart that we drew together, basically what you're doing when you try to trace a drop of blood through the heart is you're just listing all the structures that we drew out together on the whiteboard in sequence. So the drop of blood is going to come back from the systemic veins, the IVC and the SVC, the inferior vena cava, the superior vena cava, into the right atrium. And it's going to pass the what valve? Tricuspid valve, and go into the right ventricle. And then it's going to pass the what valve? The pulmonary valve, and go into the pulmonary circuit, the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary arteries, the pulmonary capillaries, and the pulmonary veins. And then back into the left atrium. And then between the left atrium and the left ventricle is what valve? The mitral valve. And between the left ventricle is going to contract, and between the left ventricle and the first big artery of systemic circulation, the aorta, is the aortic valve. And then blood's going to go all the way out into the systemic circuit to most of the named arteries that we're going to talk about in the rest of the class, and through capillary beds, provide oxygen to tissues, and then come back through the systemic veins and eventually back into the right atrium. But anyway, if we're just tracing a drop of blood through the heart, we would just list the structures of the heart that the blood moves through. And the blood moves through the heart in sequence like this, but both atria and both ventricles are contracting together at any given time. So it's going to take multiple heartbeats for the blood to move all the way through the heart. And I'll show that in the next few slides. Okay, so this, don't get too intimidated by this diagram here. This is just showing our drop of blood as it passes through the heart. And so here's the blood in the systemic veins, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And in the next interval of time, that blood's going to have moved into the right atrium, past the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Then now we're going to, so the ventricle is relaxed in these two diagrams, and that allows the ventricle to fill with blood, and the ventricle is going to contract here and squeeze the blood up into the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries. So this is one heartbeat. The heart is relaxed here and then contracts here. And now the blood is going to be pushed off to the lungs, to the pulmonary circuit. And while it's in the pulmonary circuit, the heart may beat a few more times. And then the blood is going to become oxygenated in the lungs. We're going to go from deoxygenated blood that's delivered to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries to oxygenated blood that returns from the lungs through the pulmonary veins. And now the heart is relaxed again. Blood is flowing from the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, and from the left atrium just down into the left ventricle. And now finally the heart's going to beat. It's going to contract as we go from here to here and push the blood past the aortic valve into the aortic arch. So here's another heartbeat. So the point for all this, because I feel like I'm getting a little wordy here, I'm sorry for that. Thankfully, you guys can just put me on pause and step away and come back once you've had a little break or a diversion. But the point of all this is it takes several heartbeats for this to happen. The blood doesn't move all the way through the heart during one heartbeat, one cycle of diastole and then systole. there are several heartbeats going on. We go from diastole here, here, and here to systole. And yes, the right ventricle is contracting here. The left ventricle also is, and it's moving a different volume of blood at this time. Then maybe there will be a few heartbeats while the blood is off in the lungs, and then the oxygenated blood comes back from the lungs, and the heart's relaxed. It's ventricular diastole as blood enters the left ventricle and fills the left ventricle, and now another ventricular systole. The ventricle is going to contract and squeeze blood out into the aorta. So multiple heartbeats are required to move a single drop of blood through all chambers of the heart and through pulmonary and out through systemic circulation. And many more heartbeats will probably occur while the blood is out in systemic circulation. You know that's true. The heart beats 70 times a minute. So lots of heartbeats are going on while the blood is out delivering oxygen until it comes back. Okay, so I was just mentioning the heart rate. The heart beats between 70 and 80 times a minute when you're at rest, more when you're active, and we need to deliver more oxygen and nutrients to tissues. I've been using the terms systole and diastole a little bit in the lecture up until this point. Systole just refers to when a chamber of the heart is contracting, and the myocardium is generating tension and squeezing, pushing, pumping blood. Diastole is when a chamber of the heart is relaxed, and it's during diastole that the chamber can fill with blood because the relaxed muscle makes a bigger space that more blood can flow into. So if we just use the word systole or diastole, usually we're referring to the ventricles, and most often to the left ventricle, even though the left and the right ventricle contract basically at the same time. But we can be more specific. If we want to talk about when the atria are contracting, we can say atrial systole and atrial diastole. And if we want to be specific, we can say ventricular systole and ventricular diastole. So during atrial systole, the atria are contracting. The ventricles are relaxed, so the ventricles are in diastole, and then the ventricles contract, and that's ventricular systole. Well, the atria are relaxed again, that's atrial diastole. So just remember, systole means contraction, diastole means relaxation. So if we want to think about how the heart beats, we start off with all chambers of the heart relaxed, and we just say that's diastole. Then the atria contract and squeeze blood into the ventricles, that's atrial systole. And then the ventricles contract and squeeze blood into the great arteries, that's ventricular systole. And if we don't say atrial or ventricular systole, usually we mean ventricular systole.